Good evening, Happy New Year, and welcome to this first session of Duke Reads for 2001. I'm Frank Stasio, host of The State of Things from North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC. Tonight I'm going to talk with Michael Valdez Moses, who is an associate professor of English at Duke. He is the co-editor of the journal Modernist Cultures and a contributing editor to Reason magazine and Reason.com. He's been visiting fellow at the Humanities Research Center at the Australian National University, a Duke Fellow, Endowment Fellow at the National Humanities Institute in Research Triangle Park, and a USIA visiting professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and the University Qadi Ayad in Marrakesh. So we begin our discussion with the book this month, Thomas McGuane's 92 in the Shade. Start with the very first question. First of all, welcome. Nice to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Terrific book, isn't it? I mean, it's a fun read.
It's a hilarious book and just a wonderful piece of literature.
Let's start up with the first question right away. And of course, as always, we invite your questions as well as the conversation continues. Though the Vietnam War, Watergate, and political history of the United States provide a distant backdrop for 92 in the Shade, McGuane's novel is a satiric and moving portrait of the American Republic in peril. What is all this trouble with our republic, to which the opening sentence of the novel refers, and how does that bear, do you think, on the main action of McGuane's novel?
Well, written as it was in 1972 and 1973, certainly the Vietnam War does provide a very important backdrop to the story, and the Watergate hearings were in fact going on television even as McGuane was writing this novel. So I don't think McGuane is interested in writing a novel about Vietnam or about Watergate, but he's interested in describing a world in which the effects of politics, of American society, seep in and affect the actions of all the characters all the time. And in some ways, it's a comic, very darkly comic novel about this kind of corruption of the American public that gets, if you will, it's a kind of infection that affects, if you will, the lives and the souls of all the major characters. Sometimes it's put to comic effect, ultimately to tragic effect. And as we move along this novel, we feel that the characters' motivations, their personal histories, their intimate relationships are somehow constantly affected by these forces that are outside but omnipresent.
What are some of the other hints in this book? I mean, you know, the opening sentence includes this trouble in the Republic, so there's a clue that we should be thinking about the national backdrop. What are some of the other clues for you that this is more than just a group of eccentric characters in an exotic place?
Well, sometimes it's just the prose itself. In other words, McGuane, or if you will, the author, will sort of intercede and really sort of provide us a kind of journalistic commentary at moments. So one doesn't have to look too far in order to get those hints. But he's constantly reminding us, such as the fact that the main characters are skiff guides in the Florida Keys, and, you know, once a chapter or several times a chapter, a Navy jet will come flying through. There will be sort of test runs by pilots. So we're constantly being made aware of the fact that the war is not that far away, either historically or even in terms of geographic distance. Skelton's grandfather, Goldsboro, is a sort of old Florida hand in terms of Florida politics, and turns out to be just a tremendously corrupt politician. A funny one at that, but one who is still trying, in effect, to run his grandson's life. So we have all of these reminders kind of in a miniaturized way or on a smaller scale, right down in the Florida Keys, of what's going on around the globe.
Do you think McGuane is making, I mean, for me, he seemed to make deliberate reference to the other great American novels, certainly to Melville, to Huckleberry Finn. I think the voice of Tom Skelton, this kind of innocent, you know, victim who's trying to make his way through a very corrupt world.
Yeah, he's a kind of Candide character, this man of you know, good intentions with a heart of gold, and the best of all possible sort of noble goals. Indeed, he uses this word noble to describe himself. Nevertheless, kind of stumbles into this world, which is, the best of all possible worlds, but not one that's good enough to uphold his own dreams of what America or his own life should be like.
He stumbles and yet seems to also be on a mission at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's both one of the most puzzling but one of the more interesting things about this novel is what drives Tom Skelton. I mean, here's a guy, we know that he comes back to his hometown in Key West after presumably being involved with, drug traders, drug dealers. He's been at least probably addicted to various kinds of amphetamines and probably hallucinogenics as well, or at least has been a frequent user, and has come home, we presume, to sort of straighten out his life, to get his feet back on the ground, and to get a kind of fresh start. And one of the very first things he does is sort of wakes up in this semi-hallucinated state, finds a pistol on himself, has no idea where it came from, tosses it away, and then sort of heads on home. So we figure here's a guy who wants a clean slate, wants to get a job, have a direction, get his life in order, get a girl, settle down. But over the course of the novel, it turns out that those are very difficult things for him to accomplish. And it's not because he's ill-intentioned or unintelligent or ignorant. It's rather the world in which he moves and the system that he has to encounter.
The world in which he moves, the system he has to encounter, everything outside of him, but his own history and genealogy, it also seems, is something that's inescapable.
Yeah. It really is almost like a Greek tragedy in certain ways that, your genetic inheritance is your fate. And it turns out that he has a great deal of his grandfather in him, and his father, who is also, I think, certifiably insane, certainly acts that way. And there is a sense in which his best efforts to escape family history or the history of the Republic, to use that opening phrase, is doomed from the start, that he really is kind of fated to a violent end.
It brings us, let's ask this question, and I think it's a very good one. This one from Melanie. I'm interested in the theme of sanity and madness in the book. Do you think Skelton's dedication to building his guiding career, even in the face of threats from Dance, can be partially explained by his desire to maintain a grip on sanity, holding a respectable job in a way that his father was not able to do?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question, and I think it's right on the mark. I think that is part of what he is trying to do, and it's part of that, I think, kind of the American grain that holding a steady job is almost by definition what it means to be a normal, upright American. Now, he happens to pick a profession that's, sort of in one of those gray areas, as it turns out. It's just on the margins of respectable society. But certainly, he's very serious about this. He studies the shoals, the various maps of the keys. He wants to become proficient. He knows about the craft that he's going to use. He has scientific knowledge of the various marine life. He's aware of the topography. He is very responsible to his clients. He's worried about paying his bills. He's doing everything right. And so there is this sense in which, this is the world that would allow him to sort of get straight and to keep his sanity.
Do we have to worry about the reliability of this narrator?
I think we do, and it's something that I struggle with when I read this novel, because there are long passages which all I can say is it has a kind of hallucinogenic quality to the prose. We are unsure whether this is just a complete fantasy of Tom Skelton, whether it's something that's induced by a kind of physiological or pathological form of insanity, whether he's sort of playing with us. But in some senses, he is not an entirely reliable character. We can't trust everything that he says or thinks about. And part of the challenge and fun of reading this book, is discriminating between what's real and what's not.
I think that's when the book really turned around for me. I was enjoying the read. Certainly the language and the dialogue was fantastic, but I thought, is this just kind of a character sketch? You know, is this going to be a kind of Confederacy of Dunces, a fun book to read? But what I knew it might add up was when he moved into the fuselage, because that's when I started to wonder how reliable he was. But the image of somebody trying to get their life together in a plane that won't fly, the ambiguity of that and the imagery of that, I thought, oh no, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, again, this is a character who, after all, wants to, in some senses, become part of normal, straight American society, a la 1972, 73. But I would say that it's probably not the ambition of most middle-class Americans at the time to move into an abandoned fuselage of an airplane surrounded by winos and drunkards who are being marshaled, you know, sort of, and working for a local drug lord. But he really, you know, seems to, you know, absolutely thrive in this kind of atmosphere.
It's very much normalized through the book. That's a fascinating thing. That's sort of this Wonderland kind of approach.
And you have, but it's presumably shocking even to those that are around him. One of the winos comes up one day and he says, "You're the guy that lives in the bomb."
Why don't we move on to question number 2? As always, inviting your questions as we discuss Thomas McGuane's 92 in the Shade. Forced to give an account of himself, Tom Skelton grudgingly admits that his mortal struggle with his nemesis, Nicholas Dance, is a matter of honor. What does he mean by this? Let's stop right there. What do you think he means by this matter of honor?
I think that both Dance and Skelton, oddly enough, even though they are opposed to each other, in some senses have these principles. And the principle is, you know, keeping your word, doing what you say you're going to do, keeping your promises. And there is a sense of honor, that one doesn't want to be shamed or dishonored. The phrase that Nickel Dance uses is, "I want credence," right? He has to be a man of substance, and by that he doesn't mean that he would be wealthy or necessarily have high social status. But to have credence is to be somebody that is believed, that keeps his word. And so you have these two characters who in some senses are doubles of each other, pitted against each other. And it's partly because they're each trying to keep their word, to maintain their honor. And it happens to be that they conflict with each other, and there really isn't any way for them to resolve this, or so it would seem in the novel, without some kind of final, ultimate confrontation that leads to the death of both of them.
The question for me throughout the novel, though, was when these principles were obvious, that these guys lived by a code, even if you think about Dance's, the homicide that he committed. He just can't get away with that. Well, I'm just going to have to shoot you, you know, and that's how that goes, kind of the ethic of the Wild West.
Yeah, I do think this is a kind of Western. You know, you can call it a Southerner rather than a Westerner, set down in the Florida Keys, but I don't think it's any accident that McGuane himself ends up settling in Montana, writes novels set out in the West. And so you see that these two regions of the country that may not otherwise seem to have much in common turn out to be part of the frontier.
Well, and it's the great part of the American story, isn't it, that any of this stuff travels.
Right.
That's when you're not going to tell an American story if it doesn't have people moving all over.
Yeah, absolutely.
And carrying some of these germs. And the germ that gets carried by these guys is violence. I mean, that's the kernel that keeps getting replanted. So again, this question of principles, is it rooted, do you think, in, pardon me, in a sense of sort of authentic, finding yourself, the real self, or is it what honor means to me in terms of identity, what other people think of me if I were to not man up to this challenge?
I don't mean to evade the question, but I think both of those are true. In other words, the characters find themselves by keeping their word, by maintaining their honor. But honor, you know, is something that doesn't have much meaning except in a social situation. In other words, it's always a shared concept. There's in a novel, Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad, the main character, Jim, abandons a set of pilgrims on board a ship basically he's frightened. He thinks the whole ship is going down, and rather than go down with all of the passengers, sort of leaps overboard, and much to his distress then discovers that the craft is survives. Everybody is rescued, and now he has to come up with an explanation of why he's done this. And a French captain who's questioned later by the narrator sort of says, I can't understand how a man could abandon his honor so completely this way. And Marlowe, who is the narrator of that novel, sort of says, well, what if no one knew, if it was completely private? And the French captain sort of scratches his head and he says, that is much too fine a distinction for me. So I think this novel really gets at, if you will, the shared social quality of what honor and principles mean. Would Dance or Skelton be as determined to follow through on their word, even if it cost them their lives, if no one else knew about it?
And that means that they've internalized an ethos or a kind of sense of what this shared honor is. And so in America, it means you don't take that kind of stuff from anybody.
Although they are somewhat exceptional characters. It's interesting. They seem to be more principled than the characters around them, who are willing to back down, to shave the truth a little bit, to evade matters, or to look the other way. And I think it's one of the reasons that they sort of step forward as the main characters in this novel.
But what do you make of Dance's repeated efforts to kill himself?
I think that it's really out of a sense of shame. In other words, you could say that, you could give a medical explanation and said he's depressed, he drinks too much, he's not making any money, he's down and out. There are all kinds of sort of sociological reasons that you might give, but it's also that he feels that life isn't worth living if he can't be looked up to. And so it's that, sort of the code of the samurai, if you will, displaced to be sure among fishermen in the Florida Keys or skiff guides, but nonetheless I think they share something in common.
I wonder if we've taken we may have answered the rest of these, but I'm going to run through them to make sure. What does he mean by this? To what principles or convictions, articles of faith, does he adhere? I think we talked about that.
Yeah, we have. At least Skelton also claims at various points, and I don't know how seriously to take him, that he's a Christian. And this comes up on a number of occasions and sort of insists that his ethical background is basically of a Judeo-Christian sort despite himself. It's sort of not something that he's chosen, it's something that he's been given. And so that too is part of his code. The thing about the word honor that I wonder about is its importance in public rhetoric at the time. Nixon, after all, has just given, famous speeches during the election about how we will only leave Vietnam if we have peace with honor. And the implication is if we leave, we can't just turn tail and run. We have to do this honorably. And I think in some ways that sort of that phrase haunts this novel. And it's sort of like, well, what does it get you? Well, it can get you some, sort of pretty nasty consequences as a result.
The same defeat, only with greater loss, I suppose. So what is it that he is, why is he going home? What's he looking for on his return to Key West? And why should his quest lead inexorably to violence and tragedy?
Well, it leads inexorably because to violence and tragedy, I think, because he's a man of principle. I mean, it would be very easy for him to say, I'm going to give up being a skiff guide. I'm going to find another job, whether it's, fry cook in one of the seafood shops down in Key West, or, maybe I'll just work as an accountant. And it's interesting that Nickel Dance basically gives him as much leeway as possible. Even says at one point, one of the other characters sort of asks Dance, sort of, are you going to let this guy buy a boat, even though, the builder won't have time to build yours, while he's taking care of Skelton's order? And he says, well, I didn't forbade him to build the skiff. I only forbade him specifically to work as a guide. So there's a kind of literalism here, and the characters are really sort of determined to act according to their will. And it's almost, I would say, it's a test of wills, and violence is inherently part of that. It's always about not blinking, not looking away. And again, I think the analogy that you drew to the Western is a good one. You could say, why not just sort of turn in your guns, you know, when you reach town, or, you know, like head on out into the open plain and not confront your antagonist.
Well, and think about the paradox of exercising your will to the point where the consequence is the ultimate loss of will.
Absolutely. And I think, in a way, it's what lends seriousness to this struggle. In some ways, you could say this is a very trivial story. After all, what is the argument about? It's, you know, one man insisting that another not compete with him as a fishing guide down in the Florida Keys. What could be more trivial than that? And what elevates, I think, the novel and the characters in our estimation as readers is precisely because they are, in a sense, men of principle. It comes down to keeping your word even over a trivial thing, because it is part of your worth as a man, as a citizen, as an upstanding member of an imaginary community.
And it's not just any job. These guys want to be guides. It's not just that they, I mean, you know, sort of at the symbolic level, when you think about the image, it's not just that they want this career for themselves, and in Skelton's case, to pull his life together. He thinks he can help other people. He thinks he can lead other people through the swamp.
Yeah, no, they are leaders of a sort, and it requires technical skills, it requires study, knowledge. There's also an art to it, and I think something that appeals in particular to McGuane, that you're kind of an artist, if you will, of the Keys. You know it backwards and forwards, and all the sort of ins and outs and all the sort of tricks of the trade. So in many respects, they represent certain qualities in America and in Americans that I think we're supposed to admire.
Did you ever find it, because we did learn an awful lot about the skiff and navigating.
More than I ever thought to know about.
Well, and that was kind of a Melville quality too, you know.
Absolutely, it reminds me, and I'm sure others as well, of the famous chapter on the science of the whale, where you really sort of think, did I really need to know this much about the kinds of engines that go into skiffs, or the intricacies of tidal flows in the Keys?
A great book nonetheless. Did we, let's see, yes we did. Why don't we move on to question 3, inviting your questions as well. The dramatic action and human violence of 92 in the Shade takes place against the extraordinary natural beauty of the Florida Keys in the Caribbean. In the years since McGuane wrote his best-known novel, he has become a prominent conservationist and has written several works in celebration of nature and the outdoors. What role does nature and the natural world play in 92 in the Shade?
An important one, otherwise I don't think we'd be asking this question.
Well, that's a good point.
But it provides a kind of escape and release from, if you will, the human action. It really provides us with a contrast to this constructed human world of social conventions, of moral codes, of market exchanges, of technology. It's always there. It doesn't speak directly to the characters. I think in some ways it's meant to speak more to us as readers, that we are meant to see these characters against a kind of sublime natural background. And it's the world that is, at least in this novel, uncontaminated by humans. It's indifferent to those human beings, but it's beautiful, it's greater than they are, and it puts their struggles in perspective. And we see it very differently than if you will, we had sort of only close-ups of the characters in sort of in interior shots.
But as you say that, it's true that while the natural world is always with us in this book, we don't feel any great intimacy between them and that world that they know very well. They know it intellectually, or they know it as a matter of skill and craft.
You mentioned Moby Dick earlier, and I think the ocean and the whale itself provide a kind of counterpoint to this novel. Here, it's perhaps not as spectacular, much smaller fish, not the open sea, but the Keys. But it's this world that, precisely because it's not the human world, allows us to see both the triviality of human actions. It now can make them seem, if you will, just insignificant. But it also is the kind of greatest backdrop possible. It can have exactly the reverse effect, in which it's just characters acting before nature, which is indifferent to them. And so it sort of gives these characters, who might otherwise seem squalid, a kind of grandeur or heroic stature. And again, I think that it also allows us to ask questions about the moral presuppositions of the characters themselves. In other words, nature seems to be silent about this great struggle between the two characters, and we wonder, well, is there a moral issue, and if so, is it grounded in something larger than just what people say is important or what is right? The question of nature and nature's relationship to God actually comes up explicitly in a couple of places. I don't think McGuane answers that question. I think he avoids it. But I think, if you will, the divinity of nature might be one way of understanding what he's about in those passages.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think the silence of nature and their lack of intimacy with it speaks loudly about the power of these social constructs to drive men to violence and not really sort of miss the point of what a guide would be all about. Why wouldn't a guide sort of focus on the water and the fish themselves, and not the competition with the other?
Yeah, this is not, even though the novel is written in the 70s, it's not sort of ecological or conservationist in its import. This is a kind of older, almost biblical view of nature, rather than a sort of modern environmentalist description or depiction of it. And so these characters, interestingly enough, they know a great deal about the local habitat, about fishing, but it's very much a kind of utilitarian exercise. They know it so that they can engage in a commercial activity. They know it so that they can show other people where to fish, and when to fish, and how to fish. But there is, Skelton, maybe he's a little different, but they're not interested in nature for its own sake. And that would bring them outside of themselves and outside of the kinds of activities in which they are immersed on a day-to-day basis.
Could this book have been set anywhere? Could they be fishing guides on trout streams in Montana?
I think it could have been set elsewhere, but perhaps not everywhere. I mean, I know that, in other words, I think this novel might not have been set as effectively in a completely urban environment. So could it have been set maybe in, the heart of Africa, or in Alaska, or, in the Wild West of, 19th century Montana? And I think the answer is yes, and we've touched upon that before. But I do think it's important that nature is there in contrast to the society and the manners and the sort of human world of these fishing guides.
It did strike me that the Keys is one of the better places because of the sort of the ambiguity of the law. I mean, there's a kind of sort of a gray area in a lawless territory in the United States.
No, and I think that's one of the ways in which this novel connects up with some of the traditions in American literature. We've talked about Moby Dick, you mentioned Huckleberry Finn. Could you write Huckleberry Finn without the Mississippi River? Well, I suppose you could, but it would be a very different book. Can you write a Western without a Cormac McCarthy novel without, the landscape of, South Texas or northern Mexico. And you could transplant it somewhere else, but I think without that kind of what I would call the master shot of nature, with these human characters sort of small and not necessarily insignificant, but put in their place by that larger shot, we'd be missing a lot of what's going on.
Move on to the next question. Did we answer all the questions in this one? Third, yeah, what role does the natural world? So, number 4, though it comes to an inevitably tragic conclusion, 92 in the Shade is distinguished by its sardonic humor and its extraordinary prose style. In what ways does McGuane's black humor and verbal pyrotechnics contribute to this distinctly American voice?
Again, it's one of the things that we talked briefly before the show began about Thomas McGuane's film version of this novel, which came out in 1975. And although quite faithful to the novel, not surprisingly, since McGuane wrote the script, directed the film, it comes across as relatively humorless and a little flat by comparison to the novel. I thought maybe I'd just read one brief passage where we get this sort of quality of his humor. This is where an early passage in the novel in which Nickel Dance is making his way to Key West for the first time. Here's the passage. He'd driven those many miles without any terminal mechanical trouble, but on Southard Street in Key West, the brake drum had had enough and caught fire. Burning rubber and oil from the brake line slowly worked into the Fairlane proper, which is loaded down with belongings, including a Motorola TV, the pistol in hand, and a case of government ammunition. Nothing to do but stand back and watch her go. When the flame reached 8 feet over the sputtering convertible top, the ammunition began to fire, and then the television let go. Dance had the Bisley Colt in the top of his pants underneath a palm leaf sports shirt he had bought in St. Augustine, and great alligator tears swam down his cheeks. The truth was he felt free as a bird. And now my favorite line. A burning Ford full of things that blow up does draw a crowd.
So it's a cinematic genius, so you can see why it became a film.
It's and the novel is just filled with these sort of virtuoso passages where you really feel that the main goal is just to write funny, beautiful, remarkable lyrical prose.
And it is, I said that as you read of a cinematic passage, and yet, of course, it's going to be humorless. Without reading that line, without speaking that line, a Ford full of stuff that blows up, then you're looking at a Ford that just blew up. Not so funny necessarily.
Yeah, and I do think that it's part of the problem. You just miss the voice that McGuane creates. His authorial voice is just incredibly and consistently funny, witty, insightful, and it's very often sort of small turns of phrases. It's the timing, and unfortunately that is something that you miss with the sort of pure visual.
How much do you think, violence is obviously at the center of this book, but what's interesting is the violence in Skelton's life and Dance's life that preceded them, that what they inherited. How that seemed to me a central point for McGuane, that inherent in the American experience is this inescapable violence that's generational. I mean, that's how this country was settled. You had to move people off the land and then tell a story about how that's okay. And it's that lie that people seem to be pushing out of their minds and replacing with something like honor.
Yeah, and perhaps even more troubling is the possibility that honor and violence have always gone together. That we're seeing both the negative and positive aspects of the American political experiment. Not the only one that has that particular equation, but certainly in this novel, there are references to almost every war of any significance that the United States has been involved in. The Civil War, World War I, World War II, more Vietnam, the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War, the frontier wars against the Native Americans, the Revolutionary War. I can't remember if the War of 1812 gets mentioned or not, but Andrew Jackson does. Yeah. So it's almost a kind of, it's not particularly obtrusive, but as one reads the whole novel, one sees a kind of encyclopedic classification of America at war. And surely the fact that the U.S. was just coming out of the Vietnam War as this novel was being written is pertinent, but it suggests that there's something deeply ingrained in the American character and in the American liberal democratic experiment that required violence, whether it was settling the country, expanding its borders, defending itself against enemies, taking a prominent place in the world. And I think we're meant to feel that, you know, good or bad, it was integral to the American experience, and that although Skelton is an eccentric, an oddball, a sort of guy that kind of calls his own tunes, nevertheless he is also emblematic of something that is basic to the American character.
And while McGuane, I think, is brilliant in painting that big picture about the sort of the panorama of a national history and what that might mean, it's also personalized. I mean, Skelton suffers from his father's upbringing, who we learn had a troubled experience with. He came back damaged from a war. Yeah. People get hurt by these things.
Yeah, and again, I don't think McGuane is simply trying to represent American violence in an uncritical fashion. I think it's a book that's really deeply critical of that particular vein. I think McGuane, however, also, like writers of Westerns or science fiction epics or fantasy epics or let's take detective fiction, is both fascinated and horrified by violence. Partly because it's a wonderful dramatic device. You know, Homer's Iliad would probably not be quite as successful if the men in it weren't quite so violent.
And I think he does. I think it's a national, it's a question of a particular country and how that nation emerged and evolved. But yeah, it seems to be also endemic to humanity, and that's what makes it an epic rather than a...
and indeed, even to Americans more generally, it's, although most of the characters in the novel are men, and the key characters are violent men, it's interesting that violence characterizes even the women. Tom Skelton's girlfriend, Miranda Cole, and one of the other characters, I'm just trying to think of her name right now, Farron Carter's wife, actually have, you know, sort of fight it out over the picnic table. So you have two women who are basically, you know, it only takes a few quick exchanges and sort of for them to be duking it out at lunchtime. So there does seem to be something that is, you know, if you will, inherently violent about Americans.
Question number 5. Tom Skelton is a man whose every effort was toward being a single member, an intentional community, often read as a quintessential countercultural novel of the early 70s. 92 in the Shade seems to portray mainstream America, particularly its investments in technology, commerce, consumerism, and social respectability, in an unflattering light. What's the relationship in McGuane's novel between mainstream and counterculture American values?
We talked earlier about the fact that Skelton begins his quest, if you will, having left behind, you know, presumably a pretty shady past in dealing drugs. His grandfather is a state senator, and by that I mean a senator in the state legislature of Florida, but a notoriously corrupt politician who has been involved in all kinds of illegal economic and political schemes. his father, who initially just seems to be a kind of basket case, turns out to have organized and run a whorehouse among his many sort of activities. So the whole Skelton family has been involved in one way or another with these kind of criminal activities. And so the odd thing, I think, being that the most respectable member of the Skelton family is Goldsboro Skelton, Tom Skelton's grandfather, and yet he too is a crook. So there's something about these characters that they're always off, that you sort of scratch the surface of mainstream America, and underneath you find eccentrics, oddballs, and above all, people whose relationship with the law is deeply problematic. It's as if Americans somehow are not only violent, but they really have trouble abiding the law.
And it is a romantic picture. I mean, the Keys, that whole idea of a place where you can make a life of your own and run away from your own past, we love that, don't we?
No, I think that these characters are loners. They are, I think one of the characters talks at one point about wanting to be a sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but a sort of community of one, a voluntary community. So this notion that we are, as Americans, all isolates, individuals, those who, quite frankly, can't be burdened by authority very comfortably, that we are revolutionaries in the old American sense, is pretty important to the portrait that we get here.
Would characters like this, how well would a character or these characters translate to European readers? Do they even recognize these guys?
I think they would recognize them immediately as American types. You know, cowboys, you know, firing away.
But do they identify with them in the way we would?
Perhaps maybe more so now with the degree to which American cinema has begun to affect contemporary European cinema, but it's much less a sort of settled society. This is, in some ways you could say, and here I'm echoing Leslie Fiedler, an earlier critic of American literature, when I would say that this is in some senses a romance. And by that I mean a romance in not just about a love story, but it's a romance or a quest that takes its characters outside of ordinary middle class or bourgeois society and places them in extreme situations. They're always sort of in a way, whether it's Huck Finn or it's you know, the characters of Faulkner's novels or those of Hemingway's, they don't tend to be, you know, sort of good church-going boys who stay at home, mind their manners, and become respectable members of society. And the ones that do, like Jay Gatsby, turn out to be, you know, once again, sort of criminals, outlaws. And this novel really is in the American grain in that respect. It just you know, sort of brings it up to date.
Yeah, you know, you talked about the glorifying the loner. There's that one passage in the book where Skelton sort of plays with the idea of communism and then the word communism, and he said, well, they're not communists, they're communists. Of course, these are our enemies, so we're meant to hate these people. So it's our enemy is the communist. It's anyone who feels that there's some commonality. We eccentrics, we loners of it.
Yeah, in fact, we learn about Tom Skelton's father that among his many strange projects, at one point he's organized Catholic anarchist reading rooms, so, which seems to me to sort of get at precisely both the strangeness and eccentricity of these characters, but also we have this word anarchism. You know, it's really sort of, I want a place for everybody to come together so they can be completely individualistic and learn, you know, why the law shouldn't apply to them.
Hard to enforce silence, but otherwise a good idea. Yeah. It is true. And the other theme that we haven't really talked about, although you raised it at one point, and it did strike me as important to this book, was a kind of religious or spiritual theme. I mean, there's a kind of gospel-like quality to the going to the cross, right? The intentional walk up Golgotha that Skelton takes.
It's interesting. McGuane's biography reveals that he was raised a Catholic. I don't know one way or the other whether he has remained a practicing Catholic, but certainly in some of his interviews, he's credited that upbringing with shaping his outlook and having an influence on his fiction. And so I think that for all of the anarchism, sort of anti-authoritarianism that is part of this novel, there's also a sense of deep spiritual commitments and the importance of both what we might call religious guidance and ethical dogma for the characters themselves. So you could say, why does Tom Skelton do what he does? Why does he go to his death? Well, one of them is a kind of model of the suffering Christ. In other words, I will do whatever it is necessary, even at the cost of my life, in order to be faithful to my beliefs and convictions.
Even though, yeah, knowing that this is how it has to end. I began to wonder about that when he, again, outside his fuselage, when we see him consorting with these winos, and on the one hand they're derisive of this guy who would live this kind of a life, but on the other they're very much attracted to him, and he is quite accepting of them in ways that the folks around him aren't. You don't want to live around them, do you?
Right. No, he's really, I would say, free of most social prejudices, and that comes across throughout, I think, the novel, in that he actually likes Nickel Dance. He likes the man that's going to kill him. He likes almost all the characters in the novel and has a kind of tolerance and acceptance. And I think part of it grows out of his own sense of his own eccentricity, of his abnormality, of the fact that he not only doesn't fit in, but doesn't want to fit in, and admires those who are, in that respect, like-minded. I don't know if the phrase, like-minded eccentrics or individuals, but there is a kind of tolerance that's very appealing about his character.
Every effort toward being, we talked about counterculture, and I think we've answered that question. There's another part of this. Often reads as a counterculture novel, early 70s, 92 in the Shade, seems to portray mainstream America in an unflattering light. What's the relationship in McGuane's novel between mainstream and counterculture? I think we've done that too. I want to get to the last part of this, and I've lost my place. In what respects is Skelton an archetypical American literary hero?
Well, again, I would say partly it's being a loner, being an individualist, but also having what I would call a kind of personal code. I know it's a bit of a stretch because it's not a work of literature, but if you think of the Humphrey Bogart character in Casablanca, these are characters, they end up in, sort of washed up or in odd places in the world. It's Casablanca, it's the Florida Keys, it's the Far West, it's, Jack London in Alaska, it's Ishmael on board the Pequod, they can end up anywhere in the world, and yet they are distinctly American. And they're distinctly American in part because they want to do things themselves. They are incredibly self-reliant. Above all, what I'd say is they are independent. They really value their personal freedom almost above everything else. Do they have a sense of responsibility? Because you could say, being free just means you're free of responsibility. And that's probably part of the secret attraction, is fewer responsibilities. You don't have to make nice in society. You don't have to respect, if you will, the little local gods of your community. But on the other hand, they all seem to be, find it absolutely necessary to have and to keep a personal code of ethics. So they are once free, but also what I would say responsible to this self-generated morality.
So on the one hand, you could say that they characterize many of the sort of the characteristics and we might call them flaws in American culture taken to their extreme. This idea of individuality, the idea of a code rooted in violence or at any cost. On the other hand, it does seem to me to be redemptive, that they're finding a way through this. So they're very much the character that is the malady, they are the illness, trying to use those very characteristics to make the cure a redemption.
Yeah. Again, I think there's a very strong tragic strain in American literature, and in some ways you would say whatever flaws these characters have, insofar as they are willing to die for their beliefs, they lend those beliefs credence. And I use that word specifically because it's the one that Dance puts so much emphasis on. That their morality may be strange, eccentric, not widely shared, problematic, even lead to destruction around them, but the fact that they are willing to die for it lends their characters and their beliefs a grandeur that they would otherwise lack.
And you think this book very much holds up outside of it, the time in which it was written?
I would say that in some, it's unmistakably a work of the 1970s. It has all the hallmarks, and when one sees the film version, it's sometimes painful just how incredibly marked by the time it is, with his sort of styles and the choice of music and, the kind of washed out color palette and everything else. And yet, what I would say is that like many of the works of the finest novels from that period of time, and I'm thinking of works by John Barth or Thomas Pynchon or Robert Stone or Joan Didion, this novel really takes its place alongside many of the classic American novels, whether it's from Hawthorne and Melville and Faulkner and Fitzgerald and Hemingway, right down to the present. And I would place it right alongside many of those.
Do you think it's given its due? Do you think it's widely perceived that way?
It's probably not. I would have to admit that it hasn't gotten the kind of attention that, say, Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, which won the National Book Award the year this one was nominated. So there's a book that's sort of regarded as a classic, even if it's an unread classic. I think this novel and McGuane's work in general probably deserves a lot more attention than it's garnered, at least in the last 10 to 15, 20 years.
It's a pleasure talking with you about this one, Mike. What a pleasure.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Michael Moses is participating this month at Duke Reads, the book, of course, 92 in the Shade. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Thanks for your question. And I need to remind you that next Duke Reads will be February 8th. William Chafe, who is the Alice Mary Baldwin Professor of History, will talk about Albert Camus' The Plague. So you can send your questions in advance. We're happy to take those. The next office hours tomorrow, Friday, January 12th. I'm dying for this month to be over. I really am. Tomorrow is January 14th. It's at noon. That's office hours. Richard Lisher is the James T. and Alice Mead Cleland Professor of Preaching at Duke's Divinity School and author of The Preacher King, among other books. He's going to take questions about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Joining Dr. Lisher will be Reverend William Barber, Duke Divinity alumnus, who is president of the North Carolina NAACP, pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina. So please tune in. If you want to listen to this session again, just go to Duke On Demand in a day or so. Meanwhile, see you next month. Thank you.